So if you look at the original Dead Space, the Metacritic scores that are on the internet, for both the professional critics on the left and the users, the normal consumers on the right, you will see that the game scored extremely favorably among its audience across all the platforms that it was released on, the major platforms anyway, which is the home consoles that were relevant at the time, the PlayStation 3 and the Xbox 360 from Sony and Microsoft respectively, and for PC. These are generally favorable reviews. Then if you go to Dead Space 2 on Metacritic, and you look at, once again, the professional critics on the left and the consumers on the right, you'll see a similar trend across all three major platforms, again, PlayStation 3, Xbox 360, and PC. Extremely favorable reviews. But then if you go to Dead Space 3, there's quite a significant drop, both on the critic side and on the user side. Even more on the user side across all three platforms. So something clearly went wrong with Dead Space 3. Something didn't exactly go as planned. When it comes to not just Electronic Arts, because I think a lot of people blame specifically and solely EA for the way this game turned out. But even though EA was a major contributing factor to how Dead Space 3 turned out, a lot of the blame I would put on Visceral Games themselves, because after all, they're the ones who developed the game. That development studio made a lot of mistakes with Dead Space 3. And I'm going to go over what the major mistakes were that they made. This is my retrospective for Dead Space 3. Dead Space 3 was developed by Visceral Games and was published by EA, and the game as it stands now until the remake to the first Dead Space, which is due for release next year, comes out in 2022. This game was the last entry in the Dead Space series, and the series was considered to be a dead franchise until earlier this year. Now, when it comes to my other two retrospectives, the first for Dead Space 1 and the second for Dead Space 2, Dead Space 1 and 2 are considered, for the most part, to be great games. A lot of people love those games, including myself. Even with Dead Space 2, with some of the mistakes that I felt that they made, if I compare it to Dead Space 3, it's night and day which one is better over the other. And as I review my notes that I took for the previous two retrospectives for this particular series, I noticed that I only logged 6 cons in total for both Dead Space 1 and 2, versus the pros, which for both games went over the number 10. Whereas with Dead Space 3, the trend actually flipped. With Dead Space 3, I only have 3 pros. Regarding the cons, though, I have 17 different issues, 17 different problems that Visceral Games should have addressed before launch. Although with some of these things, once the mistakes were made, clearly there was no going back during the development process. So therefore, as it stands, when this game was coming out and EA had revealed that Dead Space 3 was a project that for sure was in development, I was beyond excited. I was hyped even, and I don't really get hyped for video games anymore. Even back when this game came out in 2013. Being hyped over a video game it's something that has become more rare for me over time. But this was one of the few. This was one of the few titles that I was really, truly looking forward to. Unfortunately, Dead Space 3 ended up becoming, and still remains, the second most disappointing video game I have ever played. Now, there's quite a few other games that have joined that list over the years, including Mass Effect Andromeda, that's one. Mortal Kombat 11, that's another one, that's a more recent one. Even Batman Arkham Knight, a game I actually do like, still failed to live up to expectations at the end of the day. But this game, this was something else. Dead Space, to me, is such a strong IP, not just in its concept, but in the execution of the first 2 games in the series, that I held on to quite a bit of hope for this game, that it would succeed, and that it would even surpass the first 2. Boy, was I mistaken. Dead Space 3 is a mediocre mess. And there were red flags with Dead Space 3 from the very beginning. From the moment EA decided to show this game off at E3, and it seemed like they were making a Lost Planet game rather than a Dead Space game. Because, the game takes place on this ice ball of a planet, and it's just completely devoid of the dark and narrow, mysterious, linear Metroidvania level design that the first two games executed so proficiently. And then there was the launch trailer, where they had like a live action version of Isaac Clarke. They were playing a Phil Collins song for some fucking reason. Yeah, I go back and I look at that trailer now, and it's just as embarrassing now as it was then. But then there's the actual game itself. And when I saw for the first time playing this back in 2013, what Visceral Games actually ended up doing with this game, I walked away pretty pissed off. Because somehow there's just no way in my mind that I could possibly think that anyone on the development team at Visceral Games or at EA thought that this game was a good follow-up to Dead Space 1 and 2. There's just no way. Let me start off with the pros. Graphically, Dead Space 3 is a huge improvement over both Dead Space 1 and 2. And you can see the evolution of all three games graphically from the first game to the third, with greater detail in the environment specifically, and with more emphasis on different effects and small details in the environment, as well as on the character models. Dead Space 3 is a true improvement graphically over the first two games. The same can be said about the presentation, which is highly cinematic compared to the first two games. And what I would say would be the best part about Dead Space 3 would be the first 3 or 4 hours into the runtime, where you're in outer space and you can freely roam to these different ships and explore these broken down vessels, as Isaac and the gang attempts to find a way to make it down to the planet known as Tal Volantis. It's in the opening hours of Dead Space 3 where the game is at its strongest, and it does feel like a legitimate follow-up to the first two entries. But unfortunately, it does not last. Once Isaac and the rest of the gang decides to depart to the planet, once again known as Tal Volantis, that's when this game's quality takes a nosedive. And that's where the true issues with Dead Space 3 truly begins. Easing my way into the cons. The first problem with Dead Space 3 is that save points have been removed, and they've been replaced instead with an automatic save system. What this does is that it forces the players to reach a scripted checkpoint in order to save their progress. Meaning, if you have to put the game down, turn off your system, just stop what you're doing because you have something else more important to attend to, and you got to turn the game off, when the player comes back and boots the game back up, they're not going to start at the very moment that they quit the game. They're going to start at the checkpoint. And so the problem with this is that you can end up losing 10 to 15 minutes or more of progress. And there's nothing worse than being forced to replay scripted sections that you've already completed. There was no justifiable reason to get rid of the save points. The save point system is something that worked extremely well with the Dead Space games, especially considering how linear those games actually are. Why Visceral Games decided to change this is beyond me. I still don't understand it to this day. Then you have what's one of the worst elements of this game's story, which is the love triangle between Isaac, Ellie, and Norton. The love triangle is one of the things that continuously frustrates me every time I go back and I decide to replay this game, because I simply just don't get why anyone thought that putting a love triangle in this game with 3 separate characters, 2 of which we already know, and the other of which is just an annoying prick, how anyone thought that something like that would be a good idea. The love triangle is ridiculous, it's forced, and it's just unnecessary at the end of the day. There's no reason why it needs to be in the game other than to provide cheap drama for the player. But considering that this is not a soap opera and it's a horror video game, or it's supposed to be a horror video game anyway, the love triangle just feels completely out of place. And it's one of the many mistakes that Visceral Games made with this. Another issue with Dead Space 3 is the weapon crafting. The weapon crafting in this game feels like it belongs in a different game. For one, the game forces the player to hunt down these resources, which replaces the credit system, which is another system that worked extremely well in the first two games. Instead of simply gathering credits and buying, new weapons or buying ammunition or buying health packs and stasis packs, instead you have to find these resources, which usually you acquire by killing enemies and stopping on their corpses to recover these various materials that you use to craft items with. Not only is this system unnecessary, but it's also annoying at the fact that you have to craft not only new weapons, but you also have to craft ammunition when you need it. You have to craft stasis packs when you need it. You have to craft health packs when you need it. And the amount of materials that the player needs to craft these things is just absurd. For example, if you want to craft ammunition, you need a material known as scrap. The problem with this is that the game expects the player to craft ammunition for every 100 pieces of scrap. You get like 6 ammunition for every 100 pieces. So if you're playing on a higher difficulty, where it's much easier to die, and it's much easier to spend ammunition because the enemies are naturally stronger, here and there throughout the game, you can find yourself running out of ammunition. And unlike Dead Space 1 and 2, where you can just, save some credits and go and buy some more, in Dead Space 3, that's not possible. Instead, you have to craft the ammunition using this resource. And the resources in Dead Space 3 is not balanced as far as how the player receives them and in what amount, as far as how much the player actually receives. They even put a mechanic in this game where you find these robots. They're known as Scavenger Bots. And throughout the game, you'll come across these hotspots that have a sound cue. So you got to be paying attention to listen for the sound. But if you hear this sonar-like sound, you have to pull up one of the Scavenger Bots that has a built-in radar and will lead you to the hotspot. And then you lay down the Scavenger Bot, and it takes the Scavenger Bots 10 minutes to find whatever resources in the area that you left them in. Now, for one, you can only get 3 Scavenger Bots throughout the game. And for 2, once you deploy a Scavenger Bot, they're going to be gone until the time limit is up, and they gather the materials that you deployed them to retrieve. But let's say you've deployed your Scavenger Bots, and you don't have any more left in your inventory, and you got to wait for them to make their run. If you come across another hotspot while the Scavenger Bots are deployed, which is an area where the resources are plentiful, in that scenario, you have to wait for the Scavenger Bots to actually finish their deployment. And then you have to go to a bench to pick them up. Speaking of which, because they got rid of the credit system in Dead Space 3, I don't even know why they brought the bench system back. It just seems like something that's unnecessary, especially considering that the presentation for the bench doesn't even line up with the first 2 games. It just seems like the bench is something that they felt they had to throw in there to make the game feel remotely like a Dead Space game. Well, if that's what they were going for, yeah, they didn't really do a good job with that. But then it gets worse from there. The new enemy designs that are in Dead Space 3 are fucking stupid. They're comically stupid. Visceral Games, I guess the lead character designer over at Visceral Games at the time, whoever that was, this person figured that, we're going to come up with some new ideas for the necromorphs. So instead of having them be like just this organic parasite that latches on to basically a host and is basically a mix of like human design and something that's reminiscent of John Carpenter's The Thing, instead the necromorphs in this game are basically mummies, like actual mummies, like out of a Brendan Fraser movie, because, that makes perfect sense. Let's change the design of the lurker from the terrifying infant variations that we had in the first 2 games to literally a canine, an infected dog that we get in Dead Space 3, because somehow I guess they thought that would be more scary. And instead it just comes off as straight silliness, like something out of a cartoon show. Also, let's make the enemies move faster than what they already were capable of in Dead Space 2. Because, that's a good way to build tension, is to have the enemy AI on screen move 10 times faster than the player character is able to. The enemies move so fast in Dead Space 3 that they basically break the game's core design, which leads to immense frustration. And so I'm sure there was quite a large number of people that started this game but did not finish it. Maybe didn't even make it halfway through the game's runtime before calling it quits. And I'd imagine that the speed of the enemies on screen is a good contributing factor to that. Oh, and, remember the plasma cutter, the awesome default weapon that Isaac uses in Dead Space 1 and 2? Yeah, they pretty much made it useless in Dead Space 3. For whatever reason, the plasma cutter in Dead Space 3 just feels extremely weak, like it doesn't dish out a whole lot of damage. It's especially noticeable, once again, when you turn up the difficulty. Again, I'm not really sure what they were thinking, but good job, I guess. They even have a classic mode in this game where the player is locked from crafting any new weapons, unless it's a weapon that originated from the first Dead Space. Again, I don't understand what they were thinking, but that's something that also was not a good idea, for obvious reasons. To make matters even more embarrassing, Dead Space 3 is much longer than Dead Space 1 or 2. In fact, it's too long, clocking in at anywhere between 12 to 15 hours depending on A, how good you are at the game, and B, if you pretty much know where everything is. But if you're just playing the game for the first time, and you really don't understand the resource system, or you don't understand the Scavenger Bot system, and you haven't memorized anything because it's your first time playing, yeah, the cons become very noticeable at that point. 15 hours, which includes side missions, is just too long. It's simply too long. And then they even have a side mission in this game that lasts for around 45 minutes. And then even after you finish the side mission, they made it so annoying to get the player back to where they were before they initiated the side mission. Again, these are all great design choices. I'm wondering if Visceral Games had like pizza parties every Friday and they threw their employees just a big celebration for their so-called hard work on this mess. And speaking of which, the Iceball planet, which is once again known as Tal Volantis, is bright and vast in regards to the planet's level design. And this, among other things, is what makes Tal Volantis a terrible setting for a survival horror game. By expanding the levels and giving the player more breathing room, the only thing that Visceral really succeeded at is making Dead Space just unscary. It's not as if the first two games were horror masterpieces either, but at least they put in the fucking effort, unlike Dead Space 3. It also doesn't help matters much that I actually can't stand the main character in this game. Isaac Clarke is far more annoying compared to his earlier depictions from the first two games. In the first two games, Isaac Clarke was shown to be extremely resourceful, as well as level-headed. In the older games, Isaac is a character that really doesn't let the situation that he's put in get the better of him. But the character that you play as in this game just seems completely uninterested in anything that's going on that's not about his ex-girlfriend, Ellie, which is another character that they ruined in this game. Ellie in Dead Space 2 was just a badass. She was basically like that game's version of Ellen Ripley. Whereas in Dead Space 3, they completely turned Ellie into a damsel in distress. Not only does she barely have any screen time in the game, but whenever she does make an appearance, both she and Isaac are always arguing about something stupid and petty, which normally goes back to their relationship, which would have been natural had this game actually been written well, and the characters actually had dialogue that was compelling and, made sense from a character arc perspective. But for anyone who was thinking of playing Dead Space 3 for the story, I can only imagine the disappointment of some of the most hardcore fans from this series. I mean, seriously, some of the worst games in the Resident Evil series, from a narrative perspective, look like masterpieces compared to the nonsense that they have in this game's story. Again, I don't know what the mentality was, but whatever they were trying to do, they pretty much failed. And I think what went wrong with Dead Space 3's narrative is that they didn't really have an idea of where they wanted the story to go in the first place, so they just And so I guess they hired someone who really doesn't have a lot of writing experience, and that person was told to basically phone it in, and that they didn't have to write a final draft. And trust me, this game could definitely use a final draft. But then it gets even worse, because for whatever strange, stupid reason, Visceral Games decided to limit the weapon inventory slots in Dead Space 3 to just 2, versus the 4 inventory slots that the player had access to in the first 2 games. And I actually thought about this a bit more with my most recent playthrough, which I conducted for this retrospective. The way the upgrade system works in this game is that technically the player can attach 2 different guns on the same frame. From the perspective of the people that worked for Visceral Games, I guess they figured, well, it may look like it's 2 inventory slots, but realistically, the player still has access to 4 different weapons. And it's like, no, that's not true at all. Another bad design choice is that Visceral decided to lock off some of the side missions to the co-op feature, and there is no local co-op in Dead Space 3. The game is only co-op online. And what this means is that people that play single player almost exclusively will never be able to 100% Dead Space 3 without doing a boosting session or 2 with someone that they don't know, a stranger on the internet. It's just fantastic, some of the design choices that made it into this game. Again, to this day, I still don't understand what the fuck they were fucking thinking. But then, it gets worse. The suits that are in Dead Space 3, they're the best looking suits that the series has ever seen. Except for the fact that you can't actually upgrade your armor just through the suits alone. And it's hard to tell whether or not the suits actually impact your inventory slots or not. I don't think they do. I think the reason this decision was made is because Visceral probably thought that they were going to give players the free choice to choose whatever suit that they personally like. Therefore, they removed the stats from the different suits in Dead Space 3, given that there's no information really on them at all, as well as the increased durability. The characters in this game, outside of the main cast, which includes Isaac, Ellie, and the Carver character, the characters in this game are extremely shallow, and they basically only serve as cannon fodder. The worst of which includes Norton and Carver, both of whom are blatant stereotypes out of a B-grade horror film. Again, when it comes to the story and the characters in this game, they royally fucked up. It's almost as if they were trying to sabotage their own game. And if that was the goal from the very beginning, well, I guess they succeeded. And then, what's easily probably the dumbest design choice in this entire game is the fact that Visceral Games decided to make the ammunition universal for all of the different weapons that the player acquires in this game. And this is a big issue because the ammunition is shared between all of the different weapons, meaning that if you run out of ammunition for one weapon in your inventory, then you run out for all of the weapons in your inventory, including the ones that the player has held in storage back at one of the game's benches. And this all falls back on the resource system, which, as I mentioned before, is fucking terrible. And of course, last but not least, and most importantly, out of everything that's wrong with Dead Space 3, the last pro I did want to mention is a weapon that they put into this game known as the Devil's Hand, which to this day is one of my favorite video game weapons of all time. The Devil's Hand weapon in Dead Space 3 is just, it's so wacky that you really can't take it serious, but at the same time, it packs enough firepower that it keeps things interesting. The damn thing literally kills every enemy in this game within one hit, and you truly feel powerful when you have the Devil's Hand equipped. On the downside, though, I don't understand why Visceral decided to lock off the Devil's Hand weapon behind the classic mode in this game. And even when you acquire it, the game does not allow the player to use the Devil's Hand on hardcore mode. The best weapon in the entire game is locked behind a subsequent playthrough. And not only is it locked behind a subsequent playthrough, but the game doesn't even allow you to actually take that weapon and use it in the other modes in the game without having to uninstall the game's patchwork, which was released by Visceral. You can use the Devil's Hand in modes such as hardcore mode and survival mode. But unfortunately, the only way you can do that is by crippling the game to one of the earlier versions. Because Visceral didn't actually intend for the player to use the Devil's Hand on a mode like hardcore mode, because that would actually make that mode somewhat of a breeze. And the problem with that is the game would actually be, somewhat enjoyable and fun. And clearly that's not really what they were going for. This is where I had to write Dead Space 3 off years ago. And I had to slowly but surely, over the course of a long period of time, accept the fact that the team that made the first game is pretty much dead. And I was saying back in 2013 that, well, I was really looking forward to this game, but it came out and it's basically a half step away from being a complete piece of shit. And I really didn't get what I wanted. And that really sums up Dead Space 3 quite nicely. The game is just a mediocre mess from start to finish, with only small beats of creativity throughout the game's embarrassingly long runtime. This is the game, I think, that truly killed Visceral Games. Battlefield Hardline may have been their last game, but I think the damage was already done by the time that game was announced. Rightfully so, there were a lot of people that just were extremely disappointed with the way this game turned out. And there's really no argument to be had or made in this game's defense. It's basically just not very good all the way around. From the story, to the characters, to the gameplay, to the length. It's just not good, like at all. I hope that EA learned a valuable lesson from the way that they mishandled Dead Space 3. I really hope that they back off from EA Motive and allow that development team to do what they are paid to do, which is to develop video games, And hopefully they avoid the trappings of Dead Space 3 primarily. Because even though I'm looking forward to the reboot of Dead Space, I know that all it takes is one wrong decision, and the whole project can just sink. All it takes is a handful of bad decisions from the development team, and Dead Space will pretty much be back in the same boat, which is a franchise that's just borderline dead, that's literally hanging on by a thread due to a passionate fan base. Hopefully the producers and executives over there at EA took a look at what happened with Dead Space 3, and the remake to the original game is truly going to be a course correction for the series as a whole. That's what my hope is. My fingers are crossed that they deliver, because I don't want to see a messy game like Dead Space 3 ever again, especially from Electronic Arts.
Shock drive enabled. Standing by.
Quick.
The world is ending, and all you can think about is us?
Damn right. I never gave up on you.
Oh no, you get up on the world.
I paid my dues. Bang. Or don't you think I'm fucked up enough already?
This is do or die. We're stuck without your help.